Have you ever wondered whether the problems in the world today would exist if we had deeper connection to ourselves, others, and the environment and acted from that place?
Welcome to the Conscious Action Podcast with your hosts Brian Berneman and Kayla Greenville, who believe that connection is the key to taking conscious action as individuals and creating a better world.
We are here to raise awareness and inspire meaningful action by sharing stories, knowledge, and conversations with thought leaders and change makers.
From sustainability to well-being and everything related to conscious living, our mission is to empower you to be the change that you want to see in the world. Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Conscious Action Podcast. I am Brian Berneman, your host, and for this episode I have the privilege of talking with someone across the ditch in Australia, Brittanie Dreghorn. Thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time to be here, for speaking with us. As I always do with all of our guests, I'm going to ask you, please introduce yourself to our audience.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Brian. Hopefully everybody understands my very thick, bogan Australian accent from up north. So I'm Brittanie Dreghorn. I'm the founder and editor of Britt's List, a publication in Australia that aims to tell the stories of Australian and New Zealand fashion brands that lead their industry in sustainability and ethical production. I could go into a whole backstory about how that's all come about, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yes, cool. And tell me a little bit more before we get into actually all of that. A little bit about from growing up. Were you already interested in some of these topics? Were you connected with nature, with the fashion industry at all? Did you care about that, or is this something that came up later in life?
Yeah, I think I have always been a little bit curious. I'd say that our family is probably a little bit more on the alternative side. My dad always used to tease my older sisters and say they had to cut their hair or he'd stick them in the hippie dip. But we always did a lot of op shopping, probably because it was cheap, not because it was a sustainable option, but I was definitely interested in it and I always thought that was cool. It wasn't until probably a little bit later in life, I probably went through a phase of doing a bit of fast fashion shopping because it was affordable and I got a taste of, being able to wear trendy clothes. But luckily that didn't actually last long for me. I was surrounded by people who did encourage me to think about the actions I was taking and the causes and effects of those. So I was thinking pretty early about who made my clothes and various other consumables. So one thing that actually really got me thinking about this, it was probably 7 years ago, is I found out there was more people in slavery now than at any other time in history because of the coffee and chocolate trade. I just thought that this was crazy and everybody drinks coffee every day. And I mean, everyone I know, everyone's sane. And it's just thinking, wow, we're all, encouraging and supporting this, growing trend of people being in forced or slave labor. And so at the time I was asking everyone about it, what can we do? And I knew there was fair trade. I knew there was a few other kind of labels for that. And I went around in Brisbane and I asked every single cafe in the CBD if they have fair trade or UTZ certified coffee beans. And a lot of them were like, what are you talking about? This was a decade ago. And I made a database online. So that was probably my first foray into conscious consumption. And it was a wormhole from there.
So interesting. And it's incredible. I always find that, how we get into these topics and how we get into actually caring about them. And it comes from so many different perspectives. And I'm always fascinated about that. And that is why with Conscious Action, we touch on so many different topics and perspectives, because I know that specific topic is the entry door for someone into the world of conscious living and to be able to be more conscious consumers. And if I didn't touch on that topic, I'm like, perhaps that person is not going to get into that. And yeah, it's the fair trade thing. It's a big thing. Like, I think that the more that I learned through all of these years of doing research and trying to inform myself and then being able to share with people, the amount, as you say, that whether it's actual slavery or modern slavery, however we want to call it, it's crazy the amount of people that are part of that, and the fact that most of us are, without knowing, part of supporting that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in every sort of part of our life. You know, if we've got an iPhone, if we buy coffee, if we eat chocolate. So it's something that we need to be aware of. But yeah, I don't know if there's a solution. So I don't like getting too far into that. But yeah, we need more solutions like fair trade that are super transparent and can help us to get our hands on these modern consumables in a way that is sustainable.
Yes, definitely. And in terms of a little bit more about you and like studying Britt's list and being able to actually share on this, can you share with us a little bit more about your path in terms of your career? Like how you got into this?
Yeah, so I have a marketing background. So I left school at 15. I wasn't very interested in it, and started a school-based traineeship as a marketing assistant. And so through that, I've been in various forms of marketing ever since. I ended up going back to university and then coming down to Brisbane and working from state government to local government and private and agency side. But I found a bit of a niche in, I guess you could say, digital content. So I've written a lot of digital content for various different things, from tourism to other areas. But I always knew that I wanted to do a content platform or a blog about ethical and sustainable fashion. When I was first looking to do this about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a couple of resources, but there wasn't anything that I could that would help me to understand what makes all of these brands ethical and sustainable. So when I was looking at them, you know, I saw a lot of brands making claims and I couldn't work out whether they were true or not. And I really wanted a resource to help me with that. So, you know, instead of just calling something sustainable or ethical, I wanted to know why, and I wanted to help everyone else understand why. So, for example, you know, we would have big brands over here like, you know, Target, Kmart, H&M, Uniqlo saying, you know, our most sustainable collection ever, or, you know, they're using recycled polyester and all sorts of different things like that. But the impact of a brand like that is obviously so huge compared to all of these amazing small brands in Australia that are producing locally. So yeah, I just thought it was an opportunity for me to create a platform and give them a voice where they can actually share the genuine, as I was saying, like genuine efforts they're making in sustainability and ethical production on a much smaller scale. And so inadvertently have a much smaller impact. So that's sort of how it's gone for me. I'm working in a digital agency now, which is I own with my business partner, and that allows me to run Britt's List with the support of our staff here as well, which is great.
That's beautiful. And do you think that, you know, you were just mentioning like a few years ago, I've noticed that this very like short period of time, the last few years and this year with COVID hitting and everything, people much more aware of these things, like from a climate change perspective, but also from a consumer standpoint, demanding transparency from brands.
Yeah, definitely. So the sustainability side of things has been building slowly over the last couple of years, which is really great. Google Trends found in the UK found that searches for sustainability and fashion were up 100% off June 2019 to June 2020. So that's, there is huge growth there, and that has been building over the years. So I think that's just going to continue to grow. That's obviously one side of the story. The other side is ethical production and who makes our clothes. And while the two are intertwined, they're also completely different. And the way brands address them is completely different as well. So I think there's still a lot of educating to be done there, as well as, what does ethical production even mean? Transparency is important, but it's very hard to have transparent supply chains when they go all the way back to where you're growing cotton, which is, potentially grown all over the world to turn into one garment. And yeah, brands do need to take responsibility for that. But, brands and shoppers need to be educated about this, because even the people who are working in these brands, aren't even thinking to make sure that they understand the impact at every level of the supply chain. So I think, the first thing for me is for people who are wanting to do better in their kind of shopping is working out where their values align. Like I said, sustainability, that's one whole thing. Ethical production is another whole thing. I say we need both, but I think to tick every box can be difficult. And that's not even touching on animals either, which is another whole area in terms of values.
Yes, definitely. And, I've been seeing for the last few years, and I remember the first time that I watched the documentary, The True Cost, and then watching River Blue and a few other documentaries that I was able to see more clearly some of the things that I was learning, and becoming part of the fashion revolution movement and running some fashion revolution events here in New Zealand, and seeing this movement. It's really interesting, as you said, there's all of these different branches and different perspectives into it. There's like understanding, like the local communities, understanding women's and child labor rights, understanding like organic or non-organic chemicals, what type of products or fabrics, understanding all of the impact with energy resources, water resources. It's huge. And I had a conversation in the podcast some episodes ago with Vandana Tiwari, that she used to be the editor of Vogue India. Now she lives in Bali, and she's an advocate for sustainability and ethical practices in the fashion industry. How this is starting to actually become more prominent in terms of the information is a little bit more out there. It's not yet mainstream, but a lot of people know about it. And I do think that it is really important to be able to, in a sense, showcase those that are striving to do the right thing. And I think that this is something really important, to be able to have a resource like Britt's List, that people can go there and can be like, these are the brands that actually I would like to support if my values align with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing that's interesting here, like you're saying, there is this growing interest, but unfortunately people, even though there is interest, people have a low understanding about what sustainability means in the fashion industry. So that same research by Think with Google found that only 12% of people have a strong understanding of sustainability in the fashion industry. Unfortunately, this means that it's easy for brands to greenwash. Because they can say anything and people will think, okay, my conscience is clear because they have said they are doing, so and so. So I do think there is a responsibility there for brands and publications to actually be educating shoppers and bringing them along for the ride. As you said, there is definitely this growing interest. And I think even this year with COVID, people are looking to support more local brands. And I've certainly seen that as an uptick on Britt's list, which is really great. But I think that we just need to, there's a lot more work to be done. And I actually think that the current focus on climate change has taken the focus off ethical production. And for brands, they're seeing this as an excuse to move all of their messaging over to, sustainability, rather than making sure that they are committing to and moving towards a living wage. So, yeah, there's work to be done. And I think there needs to be people like the person you were just talking about, to just be completely advocating, consistently, and just still trying to encourage brands to do better. Consumers can call out brands as well, but it's hard, like we can email them and say, hi, where were your clothes made? Can you please be more transparent on your website? But, nothing's stopping them from replying and just saying, yeah, they're made fairly, in this place. And then what goes further than that? I think about 6 years ago, when the Rana Plaza collapse happened in Bangladesh, 1,134 people lost their lives that day. And it really did send ripples around the planet, and had people thinking about the conditions that people were making their clothes in. That made a lot of movement, I think, in the industry. But as I said, the focus on climate change has, I think, taken a bit of a focus off the people who are making our clothes. They're not separate conversations, but they also are very big separate deliverables in terms of, where we need to see action.
Yeah, and I think that, as you mentioned, that education part, it's really important, because most people have no idea. I had no idea when the Rana Plaza collapse happened. I just learned later on. I always tell people, when I'm running some workshops or some events around fashion revolution, that I didn't think of myself as part of the fashion industry. I had no interest, even though a few years ago, I lived in New York and I worked at the fashion week. But besides that, I never thought, I'm wearing a t-shirt. I didn't think I'm part of that fashion industry and part of that fast fashion. I'm growing up, I had that, the cheaper, the better. Part of that fast fashion, and not really thinking all of the people that to make something that cheap, then what did they get paid, and which materials are this, and what is the actual true cost for the environment and for people, for animals that we have. And that education piece is super important, and the more people that know about it, the better choices we can make as businesses and as individuals. And talking about that, what is that space in Australia? I'm more familiar with New Zealand. In Australia, what can you share about that space of the ethical and sustainable fashion?
Yeah, there is a growing kind of trend towards ethical production in Australia, which is really great. We used to have a thriving fashion manufacturing industry, as I'm sure a lot of countries did, 40, 50 years ago. But it is coming back. So that's really great. And it means we're getting those capabilities back. At the moment, the main kind of hub is down south in Victoria, in Melbourne, where there is designers with a specific focus on sustainability, and also making sure that they are manufacturing here in Australia ethically. How we ensure that our clothes are made ethically in Australia, there is an accrediting body which is funded by the Victorian government partly. and that is Ethical Clothing Australia. So they actually work with the unions to make sure that ethical production here, or production here that's certified by them, is being done in line with the local labour laws. They specifically help to make sure that out workers or home workers, so people working from home within the fashion supply chain, that they're getting paid correctly and that they're also getting the same rights as they would be getting within a business. So we're looking at those things. And I mean, for Australia, this kind of accreditation is really, really great. And it just doesn't exist in that kind of level in a lot of developing countries where our clothes are made. So I think having that is really important. And I actually think that if there's something similar to that in, other countries, brands need to be looking to get those external third-party accreditations. Now, ECA just ensures that brands are meeting their legal requirements. So it's not like they're asking them to go above and beyond. And so I think that when brands don't have them, to me, that's a little bit of a red flag. It's like you either don't care enough, or you don't think there's any issues, or you're too scared to actually go and get it done. So, I think that for brands, for shoppers at home, they should be looking out for these accreditations and familiarising themselves on what accreditations mean, and then making sure that the brands that they shop with actually have them, and encouraging brands to get them as well. But yeah, in Australia, there's some really, really great smaller brands that are producing in smaller quantities and just producing beautiful, really great quality fashion at an affordable price and ethically here. So they've got a really small impact. They using fabrics like dead stock, or they're using organic cottons or ethically sourced linens and hemps and things like that. And they're helping to reduce their impact across the supply chain. Also in Australia, we have a really sustainable cotton production industry. I don't know if you knew that. You'd know and would have spoken about a lot of the issues in cotton production on your podcast, no doubt. But one of them in, I guess, a conventional cotton production is the amount of pesticides and waters that are used to produce cotton. In Australia, we've got some really great genetically modified seeds that we use that are perfect for our environment. We use really great technology and moisture sensors to make sure that we only need the right amount of irrigation, and that helps us to reduce the amount of irrigation dramatically. And we've got the pesticides down to like a bottle cap in a bale of cotton. So it's really great. It's like state-of-the-art sort of cotton production, and the quality of it is amazing. Unfortunately, it all gets sent offshore, and generally it gets blended with lesser quality cotton because it is very good. But with the knowledge growing and the understanding growing of our local cotton industry, there is becoming a demand for single origin cotton. And I think single origin cotton is a term we're going to hear a bit more in the future as people start to think about where the fibres for their fabrics come from and the traceability of that.
Yes, and it's also so important. I remember some years ago, we had Jyoti Morningstar, the owner of We Are, talking at one of our events, and she was talking about cotton and about how a lot of people don't realize that whatever we are putting in our bodies, if we are sweating and everything, like the product actually has an impact on the body. And not only that, then the impact of whenever we actually wash our clothes, like the amount of micro particles and microfibers that come out of it, and the impact that then of course they have on the environment, especially on our oceans, it's huge. And I think that is such an important thing to mention, like cotton and understanding fabrics, understanding where they're coming from. And it's interesting, I haven't actually heard that saying like that, like the single source cotton. That's a very interesting one.
Yeah, like single origin coffee, for example, which, people like for the flavor, but also we should be thinking about that for traceability as well. But you're right in terms of, all of these different textiles, they have certain environmental impacts on creation, but also environmental impacts on the end of life. And so that's another thing that brands need to be thinking about when they're creating clothes. The role of a designer is not just about making beautiful clothes anymore, or even making them in a way that has low impact, but what is going to happen to this garment when it is finished being used. So textile recycling is really growing, but still needs a lot of work. But also, natural fibers, like you're talking about, yes, cotton, there is lots of problems with it in terms of conventional cotton when you're growing it, but it's still a natural fiber and it's carbon neutral most of the time. So, at the end of its life, it's breaking down in landfill quickly. Whereas, if we're buying a polyester top, which also has a really bad impact on the environment when it's being created, because it's like basically plastic made from oil. That can be in landfill from anywhere between 60 to 200 years. In fact, we don't even know if plastic can break down, because it hasn't been on our planet for long enough. We know it breaks apart, but somehow that's worse because it ends up in our water. And just talking about river blue as well, that's another thing that, you said you saw. I watched that, and that was a trigger for me to start doing Britt's list as well, because it's just so moving to see, like, that's one impact, the impact to the world's rivers from dyeing and chemicals. That's just one impact of the fashion industry. So I think even more films like that would be really helpful.
Yes, definitely. And I wanted to ask you, because I started seeing here in the last year and a half a lot more small ventures and some small businesses starting to do clothes renting and like more like swapping things. Is that happening at all in Australia?
Yeah, it definitely is, and it's happening around the world. So clothes rental platforms are really great and a great way to lower the impact of a single garment. I think it's going to take a while to catch on. It's encouraging us to, use our clothing in a totally different way than what we're used to. So I think that is going to take a little while for consumers, customers, shoppers, whatever we want to call them, people, fellow humans, to really take hold of and understand that as a concept. It works really well for higher value items that you will only wear a few times. So I think that will become the norm in the future. The clothes swap thing is awesome. It makes so much sense. And I think just between friends, or even secondhand marketplace is growing rapidly, projected to be bigger than the fast fashion industry in like 10 years. So it's going to be massive. But, talking about swapping, there's the buy, swap and sell groups on Facebook and Facebook Marketplace, Gumtree, Depop, all of those things that are making buying secondhand clothing so much more accessible. That's going to really shift the way we consume clothing, and it's going to be much more sustainable as well, because we're thinking about the resale value of a piece of clothing. We're going to be willing to spend a bit more money on it, which means it can be made in better quality, and then they can invest better in fabrics, which means we don't need to be using synthetics. So you can see the onflow of that industry rising, and it's really positive.
Yes, definitely. And I do love, and I do see a trend towards going in general, not only on the fashion industry, to the sharing economy, like having more people open to actually open their apartments and their houses with Airbnb, and perhaps some people not even having a car to use Uber or whatever other car rental service they're using. Like, I think that there's a trend to do that, which is amazing for a lot of different reasons. But yes, it's going to take some time, and especially with things that we fall in love with. Like, there's some garments, like there's a story behind them, and there is that emotional attachment to them. And I think that that's totally okay, because I think that when we actually love our clothes, then we take care of them.
You're definitely right. Loved clothes last, and that's what it's all about. It's about seeing clothing and buying quality clothing that does last. And if we treated all of our clothes like that, we wouldn't have an issue. It's not that that's the problem. It's the fast fashion items that sort of wear once or twice and hardly last, a couple of months, let alone years.
Yes, and with that, I wanted to ask you, what's your perspective? Because I think that this, for me, is actually a really, I'm not sure yet where I'm at with this. Is mostly sustainable, ethical clothing is expensive. So some people won't definitely have the access to it. What is, in a sense, their place in this? I'm thinking of, like, let's say that fast fashion is no longer there. How are we able to actually have clothes that everyone has access to? Is that up shopping? Is that secondhand?
I think in the first instance, it is secondhand, but the secondhand stuff needs to get better. And it's going to get better when we all start buying better clothes. The problem at the moment is that secondhand isn't great in op shops because we buy fast fashion and send it to op shops, and it's not able to have another life with someone else. So I think in that term, we can move back to a model that we used to be at where, clothes were made really well and they were able to be passed down in the family. And if we could move back towards there, we'd have less of an issue because clothes would be an investment. Now, that doesn't really help with underwear and pajamas and things like that, which also need to be accessible. The fashion industry has an inclusion problem and an accessibility issue as it is. So you're right in sustainable and ethics within the industry. I mean, that's a niche. So then the accessibility of that is even smaller, whether that's body shape or size, whether that is the affordability of it, whether that is the gender inclusive part of that. We've got a long way to go, but we are starting to see that shift, which is really positive. Now, in terms of affordability, there's a big kind of sliding scale, I would say. The clothes that are being made in New Zealand are going to be quite expensive because you've got a high minimum wage in line with what the cost of living there. You can still have clothes made in developing countries that empower the people who are making them. And that is still ethical. It does help to make clothes more affordable. So I'm not saying that clothes that are not made in Australia or New Zealand are no good. They absolutely are, but these people need to be paid a living wage so they have an opportunity to create a life and get themselves out of the perpetual state of poverty that they are in. Now, this is really important because at the moment, the minimum wages in places like Bangladesh that make the world's clothes is around 39 cents an hour. So people can't afford to live on that. It's not enough for them to send their kids to school, buy groceries, and have safe housing. What we need is a living wage, which in a lot of countries is about 2 times the minimum wage. So it's not a lot of money. In that case, it's around $1.20 an hour. And this is the sort of thing that we need to be making sure that brands understand and pass on, because otherwise we are, with every purchase, just perpetuating, as I said, this state of poverty. And no matter how hard they work, they can't actually break that cycle. So in terms of affordability, I don't think, we're not talking about spending hundreds of dollars on a piece of clothing. You can still get underwear, under $20 from some ethical brands that are treating their workforce with respect. It's knowing the difference between a brand with values like that and a brand that is exploiting every level of the supply chain.
Yes, definitely. That's so important. And I wanted to, on top of that, I want to ask you, what do you think is the place for the big players in this space because they still have a lot of power. They are still the ones that are, like, even though it's not still a living wage and it's not a good life for a lot of the workers, it's still for a lot of the people in Bangladesh and some places in India and Taiwan, and Vietnam, and some countries that they create the clothing. They are actually, they need this industry. So where do you think, like, what's the place for the big players, and where do you think that we need to demand more of them?
Yeah, so you're right. They have the most power. So we really do need them to stick around. What we need them to do is understand that even though there is a market for them to sell a $5 t-shirt, the earth actually can't afford that anymore. So everything needs to change. You know, they need to absorb the cost of paying their staff a living wage. As I said, I'm not talking about paying Australian wages over in India. I'm talking about what a living wage is in their economy. And they need to look at all of the things that a normal workforce would need, and they need to factor that cost into making clothes. Fast fashion as a business model, I don't think that needs to exist. And I don't think that's the thing that are keeping people in work around the world. You know, they are in work, but if we produce less garments of better quality, that shouldn't actually change. You know, we're not talking about going from a $5 to $50 shirt. We're probably saying $5 to $10 or $5 to $15. It's this fast fashion state of buy now, wear once, that needs to go. There's no room for it in the industry. And it's these big players like Kmart, like Target. They need to look at their profit. They need to look at where they can absorb the costs into paying a living wage, and how they can shift consumer mindsets away from consuming fast fashion and towards buying less at a higher price.
Yes, so good. And I do think, you know, like, as we are talking, we're still a long way from this, but there's steps toward all of this. I think that this is where both people as individuals, businesses need to come together, government and policies need to come together, and that lack of education, because as you say, like, someone is paying for it, and it's the earth and it's the people, like, that we are taking advantage of, in a sense. And we need to put that in the forefront and be like, okay, this is not good enough anymore. Being able to see that, being able to understand that, you know, what we are doing as individuals with our purchases actually has an impact that is super big for a lot of people.
Definitely. And I think you mentioned earlier, you know, you are a part of the fashion supply chain. There's a really great quote by Ursula de Castro from Fashion Revolution, where she says, you know, the moment that you wake up and you realize that as a consumer, you are part of the fashion supply chain, well, that's when you understand that you have a responsibility to take and to make in your fashion purchases. So everybody does need to take on that responsibility and, you know, implement that one purchase at a time.
Yes, definitely. And I want to ask you, just because, as I mentioned before, I'm not that aware of the brands in Australia, because I'm all about celebrating those that actually are doing good things. Can you give a shout out to some of your favorite brands there?
Yeah, definitely. There's so many. Yeah, I can. So one is Sydney brand Citizen Wolf. So talking about inclusivity, I think this is a really great one. They make custom casual wear. So forget tailored suits. They make tailored t-shirts. You put in your date of birth, your weight and your height, and they figure out your magic fit. They only use sustainable textiles. Most of them are locally sourced. So organic cotton, they use a linen, merino and a hemp organic cotton blend. They cut out the fabric with lasers, sew it together in Sydney, certified by Ethical Clothing Australia, and send it off to you. So super custom, available in any size, and it's solving that issue of not having well-fitted t-shirts. So that's Citizen Wolf. I'm a big fan of them. ABCH is a Melbourne brand who is trying to create circular fashion. So she's looking at, Courtney Home is the founder and designer behind that brand, and she's looking at every level of the supply chain. She's making sure that every part of it is super transparent and nothing is going into these garments that cannot go back into the earth at the end of its life. So that's a really awesome brand as well. Keeping within women's wear, because they're the brands that I'm obsessed with personally. There's a couple of really nice ones. There's Fawn, making screen printed kind of textiles in Australia and sewing them together herself. There is Lois Hazel, a beautiful honest women's wear label down in Melbourne as well. And then there's kind of one-man bands who are making everything from underwear in beautiful natural fibers through to t-shirts, like men's button-up shirts with vintage, offcuts and things like that. So if anybody's looking, they're welcome to go to my website, britslist.com.au. There's plenty of brands on there that are all doing incredible work in the sustainable and ethical fashion space.
Awesome. And I wanted to ask you in terms of this, because I know this year, for a lot of different reasons, it has been very interesting and different. What has been the impact, do you think, both on like some of these brands, like there was a lot of disruption on supply chain, a lot of disruption with workers in Bangladesh and India and a lot of places that weren't being paid. But as well, this was a time as well of people being able to see things differently and think differently. What do you think the impact of this has been, and are you, in a sense, looking at it from a positive lens?
Yeah, so I think the people who are already disadvantaged have been disadvantaged further, unfortunately. So we know that people in developing countries who already don't have great access to healthcare and really can't afford to not go to work, they're the ones who have been impacted. And a lot of brands weren't paying their bills during COVID-19 either. So that didn't help as well. There is a whole campaign around that, and a few brands have now made sure that they have paid up, which is really important. I think onshore, brands that produce onshore, they have definitely realized the benefits of their local manufacturing. And I think brands that produce offshore will be rethinking their fashion supply chains and looking at how they can make that a bit tighter and have more control over it. In general, yes, huge disruption. I mean, nobody in the world in any industry has gone without disruption during COVID-19. I've seen a lot of brands in Australia and New Zealand perfect the pivot. So they're looking at various industries that they can manufacture for in the meantime, making things like scrubs and face masks, which is really great. And now people are just supporting local brands more than ever. So I've just seen a huge increase of people searching for, Australian made pajamas, Australian made underwear, swimwear, ethically made everything, basically. So it's been really positive on that front. And I think you're right. People's mindsets are changing about what they're buying and realizing that shopping is a political action and they can vote with their wallet.
Yes, definitely. The only downside, well, I mean, a lot of things, but from that perspective, from the consumer as well, was that for a lot of people, at least it has been what I've seen, being at home, actually online shopping went way up. And they started buying more things. And I'm not sure if everyone was looking for those sustainable, ethical made items or not. But that was one of the aspects that as well, like online shopping, I think that more people now got used to it, and it's going to be interesting to see how that goes forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's impacts of that as well, you know, like just the shipping, the environmental cost of shipping things around the world and then to your address. And then a lot of things that are bought online, especially at a cheaper price point, is sent back. So then you've even got that double shipping cost again. So yeah, there's a lot of things to consider there. And I think we're in a transition phase at the moment between, you know, trying to figure out the way that we buy clothes and the way that we shop. So it'll definitely be interesting to see where that lands.
Yes, definitely. And getting to a last few questions, I wanted to know, what is one resource that you would recommend to others besides, of course, Britt's list?
Yeah, don't need any other resources. No. One is the Good On You app. So that's really great. It looks at people, planet, and animals. And so you can have a look on there and align your values. But to be quite honest, I mean, you know, that app oversimplifies things a little bit. It has to streamline things. You really need to look into brands that you like and decide if that meets your values. And if they don't have enough information about their manufacturing online, you have to reach out to them and make sure that the answer actually satisfies, you know, what you're looking for. I think that there's lots of reports out there that say that, you know, fast fashion brands are good. And, you know, we just need to apply a critical thinking lens to that. I just don't know if all is what they say they are.
Yes, definitely. Well, I know with is it the Tier Fan, the guide with a lot of the fashion brands, and I saw some of the last year and the year before. I saw some of the grading, and I'm like, this is not right. Like, I know that company and what they are doing, and like they are getting a good enough grade, and they are definitely not doing the right thing. And some other brands that I know that are doing the right things, but they couldn't afford to actually show like all of the certifications or show all of the information, therefore they didn't get a good enough grade. I'm like, okay, so if someone is actually looking at that list, they might think that this one is good and that one is bad, whereas perhaps it's just the lack of information or the lack of understanding of what are we looking at.
Definitely. And this is why I'm saying, you know, we really need to take responsibility for this ourselves. You know, one report is just not going to give us the whole picture. It's not as simple as giving a brand an A+ or a B-. It's, you know, there's so many different levels of the supply chain that they need to meet all different values. So understanding what your values are, whether that's, you know, ethical treatment of animals, making sure you reduce waste, maybe you don't want any unnatural fibers, maybe you want to make sure all your clothes are made by people being paid a living wage, you know, all of these things, you decide and you go and find the brands that meet those. I think those reports oversimplify things and probably do a disservice, unfortunately, because of all of the misinformation that's out there.
Yes, definitely. And perhaps this is something already that you have mentioned, but what is your one go-to tip?
I think it's just understand what's important to you and only buy things that are in line with those values. Another big thing is to just, you know, have a good look at your consumption habits, which I know that you would address all the time on this podcast, but you know, look at your wardrobe and the impact of your wardrobe. And every time you add something to it, you know, where does something go out? You know, is it going to landfill? How long is it going to sit in landfill? I think we need to create or make shopping to be a proactive rather than a reactive response. Instead of going out with our friends or our family to go shopping and buy whatever we look at, we need to only buy things that we really want or need. And instead of just going and finding and buying the first thing you see, we need to do our research. So if you need a new t-shirt, you might look online, find 4 brands, you know, narrow it down to 1 or 2, and then choose the one that you want. And by that stage, you've bought something that you actually really love and you've really thought about. And it's likely to live in your wardrobe for a really long time.
Yes, definitely. And I heard quite a long time ago this, in a sense, technique to use when buying something, especially online, that it was a 30-day rule that if you are going to put something on your shopping cart, don't push the buy button, give it 30 days, and if you still want to buy it, by then buy it, but most likely you're not going to buy it anymore.
Yeah, I think you're right. I like to give myself a 2-week rule. I think 30 days is stretching it, but good on you.
Yes, so that's awesome. From a personal level and perspective, what has been your latest small act of kindness?
Oh, that's so interesting. I don't know. I like to call out and thank people every day for the different ways that they are helping and making the world a better place. But you know what? I'm going to have to think about that and maybe start performing much more small acts of kindness.
I'm sure that you do plenty. Perhaps you're not being able to see that. A lot of times, it's actually like a lot of times for a lot of people that naturally do things and are kind people. We don't tend to think that we just did something that is kind. We just did what we do.
I think you're right.
That's all good. And lastly, what is the one thing you wish everyone in the world knew?
Just to see how the rest of the world lives, and I think at the moment, while our borders are mostly closed around the world, it makes it difficult. But as I'm sure you would know, and a lot of your listeners would know, it's really important that we travel and we see the world and we realize the different circumstances that people live in, and actually the impact that climate change is having on other countries. We can sit at home and things are looking fairly good day to day. I mean, not necessarily in Australia where we have bushfires one day, floods the next, but whole countries are going to end up underwater. So I think having a little bit of human empathy every time that we buy something is really important. So I wish that they had the opportunity to kind of go behind the scenes and see how these people are living and decide if they still want to buy that shirt.
Yeah, so important. I'm so blessed that I was able to grow up in a sense in a place that I could see a lot of those things back in Argentina, and I was able to travel to a lot of different places and be able to see how a lot of people are living in different circumstances, and that has definitely helped open my perspective and shaped a lot of the things that I end up doing. So it's such a really important one. Britt, how can people find you and follow you?
Yeah, so if they're on Instagram, I know that social media sucks, but they can follow me at Britt's List, BRITTSLIST, or if they would like to find brands, Australian and New Zealand brands, they can jump onto britslist.com.au and search for, anything that they're looking for.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Britt, for taking the time and sharing your perspective and your knowledge. And thank you for all that you're doing. It's amazing always to see people that are passionate about something and then do something about it. So thank you so much once again for taking the time to be here. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode. And if you learned something, I would love to know about that. So comment on social media or whatever it is that you're listening or watching this. I would love to know what inspired you from this episode and what you learned, and go and check out Britt's List. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye.
See you later, Brian.
What did you like the most about this episode? Take a moment to think about what change you can make in your life today.
Share your conscious action on social media using #ConsciousAction and tagging @ConsciousActionNZ so we can celebrate your impact on the world and create a ripple effect.
One easy action we would love for you to take right now is to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast. This will help us get these messages out into the world and inspire more people to take conscious action in their own lives, contributing to the better world we hope for.